Champaign County Agriculture Today with your host, Dennis Riggs.
Hello and welcome to Champaign County Agriculture Today. My name is Dennis Riggs, your host for the next few minutes as we explore one of the most exciting industries in East Central Illinois. Yes, it's agriculture. Believe it or not, agriculture was the first industry in this area and continues to be a leading force in the economic well-being of Champaign County and East Central Illinois. Today we're going to look back and take a look at what brought agriculture to the place where it is today and examine the roots that make it such a strong industry. And we have a couple of great gentlemen with us today that are going to make that leap back in time ever so easy. With me today, we have Harold Geither. Harold is an agricultural consultant. He's a retired professor of agricultural economics at the University of Illinois. Harold, thank you for being with us today. And Danny Leifel. Dan is an amateur historian and author, which means he does all kinds of writing, and he's a retired lawyer and has done a lot of work in agriculture for all of his life. We're going to start out with a little bit of background. Harold, give me just a little bit of background about yourself, where you're from, and what brought you to this place in your life.
Well, Dennis, my home originally was in Buer County on a small livestock and grain farm. The end of World War II, I was in the Navy for about 14 months. Then I came to the University of Illinois as a student, finished a bachelor's and master's degree. I worked for an agricultural farm management and consulting firm in St. Louis 6 years, and then I returned to the University of Illinois, where I spent a very enjoyable 39 years on the faculty in the College of Agriculture.
39 years, you about got it all figured out there, didn't you? Dan, I know you've been around the area and have been working in a lot of agricultural businesses. Give us a little background about yourself and what brought you here.
Well, I'm not a farm kid. No farm background at all, except I think I have a grandfather who grew up on a farm in Eastern Europe, so that's the closest I come. I grew up in Rockford. After the Army, I had the good fortune of marrying a gal from Normal, whose parents and family grew up around the Ogden area, between Ogden and St. Joe, and they were farmers, so they've introduced me to farm background. After law school, I went to work as a prosecutor, and then followed that with 27 years with the Illinois Farm Bureau. From which I retired about 2.5 years ago, and I'm just enjoying myself.
Very good. Well, gentlemen, you have a lot of agricultural history to bring forth to us today, and we appreciate you taking the time to be with us. Well, let's talk about ag history. And I know agriculture goes back from the very first day, I understand, when the first settlers arrived in North America. They were hungry, and the people that lived here before that were hungry. So apparently agriculture has a long history. Harold, how far back can you reach back and tell us about the history of agriculture here in the United States?
Well, certainly we would have to go back to the colonial days when the first settlers from Europe came along the East Coast. What they discovered was that there were some new crops and some new products that the Native Americans were using for their food, and they learned much from the Native Americans in terms of certain crops. Corn was native to North America, not to Europe. Potatoes were native to North America. And so there were certain crops that became part of the food and agriculture production for those early colonists. And of course, what they found as after more settlers came and the quality of the land on the East Coast was deteriorating, and so then particularly after the Revolutionary War and the United States boundary reached to the Mississippi River, that the doors were open for the development of what we think of today as the Midwest. At that time they called it the Northwest Territories. And among those 5 states, of course, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, we think of today as the Midwest, the heart of the Corn Belt. And that goes back then, of course, to the very beginnings of our country, was the agriculture that has developed not only in the Midwest, of course, from coast to coast.
It just has been around for a long time. Danny, as you've explored the history of agriculture, what interesting things have you found as the agricultural industry progressed throughout the years?
Well, let me go back to the pre-colonial times and into the early colonial times. It's kind of interesting. Illinois became sort of a cultural battleground in agriculture. Whether we would have agriculture as practiced in the South, or agriculture as practiced in the North. And then there's a big distinction between the two. Eventually, the North won out, but there are some historians who think that the issue of whether Illinois would be a slave state and thus a plantation kind of agriculture just barely lost the battle, which is kind of an interesting thing in the land of Lincoln. After, of course, the settlers started coming into this area after the Revolutionary War, there became open land available for use, and there were two kinds of people essentially who came this direction to become farmers. One were those people in, say, Indiana, far off eastern Indiana, who were thinking that Indiana was getting a little too settled, and they wanted the open spaces, and so they moved here with the same kind of agriculture they had in Indiana. Surprisingly, our agriculture looks a lot like Indiana. Isn't that a shock? But it also brought in people from the east of this country and from Europe. And another thing that's sometimes not recognized is there was a lot of open land that needed to be developed. The government owed its servicemen, particularly from the War of 1812, germane to us, some kind of bounty, some kind of reward for having served in the war against the English. And one way they rewarded such veterans was with land grants in good old Illinois. In fact, my wife's family farm derives from a War of 1812 bounty. Paid to a veteran. Now, the veteran wasn't one of her family members, but they did acquire it from that person. So from there, it's developed, as I think we all know, from small plots subsisting and supporting a family, maybe a little produce extra, to what we have today, which is a kind of a commercial stream of which the production of the actual product is the beginning, but certainly not the end.
A lot of changes in agriculture. We have some pictures that we're going to take a look at to show some of these changes using equipment as kind of a benchmark. Yes, Harold, you had an idea there.
Another, to add on to what Dan has said, right here in east central Illinois, one of the biggest influences on the development of our agriculture was the Illinois Central Railroad, which was from Chicago to Cairo. Came through in the 1850s, and the government, to encourage railroad building, gave some of the federally owned land to the railroads. And of course, then that land was sold to individual farmers to go into production. But the fact that the railroad was here was why we see the influence of that development. There was a market for the grain and for movement of products up and down the Illinois Central Railroad.
So let me get that straight. The land was given to the railroad, and then the railroad sold it to the farmers to produce revenue to build the railroad?
Yes, in effect, that's partly how they financed the building of the railroad. Now, it was alternate sections on each side of the tracks. So they didn't get all of the land, but they got enough of it, which encouraged, gave them sources of money to build the railroad. The farmers who bought the land had a place to move their products to market. And of course, with Chicago, a very small city in the early 1800s, an influence that became part of the major development of the Midwest.
Now that right-of-way, the Illinois Central right-of-way, is the same right-of-way that the trains travel on today?
Yes.
That's a good history mark right there.
Yes.
Well, let's take a look at slide number 1 here today, fellas. And what we're going to take a look at is this mow-board plowing as it first began. And this is a picture of a farmer out there, and he's got his horse hooked up, and he's breaking that sod, maybe for the first time, although it looks like the prairie grass isn't too tall. Harold, you studied here at the U of I. Is that you out there behind the horse, or who is that?
Not. But I do remember when I was a very small boy that my father had 2 horses and a 2-bottom mow-board plow. And that was the way they started to prepare the was a 1 or 2 mow-board plow. And it wasn't until the tractors came along to pull a larger implement that we went to a larger number of bottoms. We had 3, 4, 5, 6 bottoms once the tractors came in to pull those plows. And of course, the most recent development has been that we no longer use moldboard plows. We have other implements to prepare the land.
Danny, what about the history of the plow and how important it is to the state of Illinois?
Well, of course, John Deere did a good deal of his work up at Grand Detour in up in Harold's home territory, and that, of course, was the self-cleaning plow, which was extremely important, particularly in deep soils like we have in Champaign County. It's interesting because along with the original work to build these things, you had to have industry created in order to construct the machinery that eventually, plows. We stopped plows, reapers, and various other production equipment, and thus we got a good deal of farm industry in Illinois, farm machinery industry.
Well, let's move along to slide number 2 then, and slide number 2 will show us how we went from the horse to the horsepower. We see that in this slide coming up here, the horse has been replaced by that evil thing, that monster, that bellowing of smoke tractor. Harold, what can you tell us about the introduction of tractors to Illinois agriculture?
Well, actually, the first mechanical farming in some ways was the steam engine, which was used to power the threshing machines in the mid part of the 19th century. Probably the gasoline tractor, as we know it, as it began in the 1920s and 1930s, followed, of course, the introduction of the gasoline-powered automobile. Mm-hmm. But it was the beginning of a real shift in the capacity of farmers to produce was when they could use mechanical power instead of horsepower. And that certainly was a major shift, particularly following World War I. And of course, that tractor that you just showed in the picture was steel-wheeled. Mm-hmm. And as we got into the mid-1930s, rubber tires moved on to the tractors. A major shift. I remember my father's first view of a rubber-powered tractor was it would never work. But once he used one, he changed his mind very quickly.
Oh, well, tractors brought about a whole different era in agriculture, Dad. What can you tell us from the historical perspective?
Right along with a more efficient, or I guess a faster way of working the land, you bring along the necessity to support the infrastructure, if you will, that supports mechanization. And one of the interesting things that developed early on in the 20s and 30s was locally owned cooperatives that started providing oil. In fact, a number of the current FS companies that most of us are familiar with began as oil companies in order to provide the material for mechanization.
That good, rich soil that we have in Illinois, back many years ago, was called muck. And we're going to go to slide number 3 here real quickly. And slide number 3 is going to show us that drainage was a very important part of soils. And we're going to show a machine here that's hard at work, and it looks like some octopus. Who knows what's going on there? But Harold, can you give me an idea of what's going on in that photo?
Well, what we found, the original prairie land, as we know, see the level land here in east central Illinois, much of it was what we would, in the early days they called swamp. And in order to farm that land, they had to get the land drained. So that drainage ditches and they're still present today, draining some of that land in order to farm it. I was told by Professor Case, who was the head of the Department of Agricultural Economics, that in his memory, some of this land in east central Illinois, Champaign and Vermilion counties, was actually not drained until about 1900. Mm-hmm. So it was a relatively later development that made possible some of the most productive land, the productive soils we have today, was getting those prairie lands drained. And the original prairie grass and prairie vegetation, I was told, was as high as the horses as they moved through the land. So it was it's quite a contrast the early settlers saw compared to what they would see today.
Yeah, an example of that is most of Douglas County was at the bottom of a lake. Mm-hmm. We don't think of that now, but of course, where was that water coming from?
Champaign.
As it still does in certain places.
Now, let folks know listening that may not know that much about drainage. What we saw there with the drainage being the actual stream, Dan, there's more to it than just that stream, too, right?
Well, another one of those great advances that I don't know who did it, but it certainly made a difference in agriculture is the drain tile. The tiling that you put out on relatively flat ground that in essence gives a buried pathway under the agricultural platform of the top of the soil that gets that water into these drainage ditches. If you don't have drainage ditches, there's nothing to tie the tile into, and so they go together, but until you get the tiling in, you can't handle a lot of this very good soil that needed to be dried out.
Yes.
Harold, I think you've got a good drainage story for me.
This might explain partly why parts of southern Illinois and northern Illinois were actually settled before some of the central part of the state, because this very question of drainage and the need to get the land, the drainage ditches built and the tiles put in order to get the moisture out of the topsoil in order to farm it.
You need an outlet, so the water has to go somewhere, right?
And I think a novel thing, I was reading a book one time back in the written in the early 1800s. It referred to Illinois as the Great American Desert, not because it lacked water, but it had too much.
Ah, okay, interesting. Well, once this land was drained and the farmers had some equipment to work on, then there's always an issue of who owns what. Where are the property lines? And people that have never seen a plat book, and that's a book that shows who owns the land in each county in the state of Illinois, are sometimes amazed by the straight lines and how this was all laid out. Harold, you want to start out with that, how this is all set up?
I think it was about the ordinance of 1787. When the early writers of the Constitution and in those early days following the Revolutionary War, they didn't know what to do with how to organize the land that they had acquired from the Treaty of Peace with Great Britain. And so what was known as this Northwest Territory, one of the features was to require that the land be surveyed and laid out in square miles. And the surveying operation then is why we have such an organized system of land definition by sections and by quarter sections. It's very methodical, very efficient, much more efficient than you will find in states to the south like Kentucky or Tennessee and out east, where they don't have these nice square surveyed land to identify who owns what property. We're very fortunate to have in Illinois and the Midwest a system of surveys that identifies land by the square mile and by the sections.
And this was all done, amazingly enough, before GPS, before lasers. How do they do it, Harold?
Well, they must have had a lot of walking to do and to measure.
It was truly measured, right?
It was truly measured by the square mile and by the sections. A section of land is a mile square. And of course, we have the English system. In parts of Europe, you have hectares, which is a different system of measurement. But even though we still wonder whether we ought to be on the metric system, I would say that our system of surveys and identification of land is a very efficient system and very fortunate one that we have.
Yeah, Dennis, one thing of interest, the chief surveyors were named Mason and Dixon. And they surveyed north of the Ohio, and so the beginning of their survey is the so-called Mason-Dixon line.
That's where that originally came from.
That's where it comes from.
That's cool. And isn't it amazing, Dan, that those lines that they laid out back then are still there today? Now, every once in a while, there's a little hiccup. There's a little jog in that. Can you explain what happens there?
Well, as I read it, they would continue on their azimuths according to their equipment of the day, and then they would eventually find that they were off. And so rather than go back and start again, they would jog and continue on.
And those little jogs in the country.
contour of the Earth.
That's exactly right.
Sure.
Sure.
North, you're with the Earth as a sphere. This is why they had to make these corrections. And so we have a jog on township lines, townships being 6 miles square. And even today, you'll find that from the original surveys, there is a correction at the township line.
And sometimes they just screwed up.
They could be off just a little bit, but they tried. Well, we're going to go to another slide now, because another change that's happened over the years as we've progressed in agricultural technology and information is we've decreased in population. We're going to bring up slide number 4, which shows the change in population, and that's going to show a steady decrease. Harold, is this predictable? Is this a good thing? Why are there less people living out there on the farms today?
Well, what we find is that with the advent of mechanic farm machinery, one farmer could farm more land, and that there were other opportunities with the industry developing, that there were not opportunities for all the young people that grew up on farms. And some of them, after getting an education, were able to move into industry. And this is where we find the growth of cities and urban areas, of course. And yet, the productivity of the farms has made it possible that we still can produce enough food to feed our own population, plus having products to export.
We're going to move ahead to slide number 5, and slide number 5 kind of puts that in perspective as far as the population and gives us some numbers actually to compare from the 1800s to 2006. And Dan, as you take a look at that, I guess if you boil that down to the bottom numbers, the percent of people back in 1800 was about 80% farming, and now in 2006 it's 0.8. Should we be alarmed?
Well, I don't know if we should be alarmed. I think the world, and particularly the United States, is changing. I don't know, at my age, I don't like change much of anything. It would alarm me to have any change at all, but this is a progression that doesn't seem to be in America alone. We have it certainly in Europe, the same kind of thing. And I might add that while the number of actual farmers has gone down, because of specialization, we actually have tiers of additional workers who are necessary, and not necessarily in growing the crops, but in processing and manufacturing. So there are a whole lot more than just 0.8% of the population involved in agriculture.
We sometimes hear about farming before the Depression and farming after the Depression. Is that a line that, was it just a date in time that's easy to refer to, or did something happen, Harold, around the Depression time that makes an agriculture a quantum leap?
Well, during the Depression, of course, the employment opportunities off the farm were very limited, and so there were a lot of young men and young women who could not find opportunities away from the farm, and our farm population actually increased for a few years during the Depression. The number of farms in the United States hit their peak about 1936 or 37 and has declined ever since. I think the combination of the Depression plus World War II are both very major factors in the 20th century that changed not only agriculture but our entire country. But it had an influence that we have to recognize.
It was a timeline as well as an economic line that happened there. We're going to move along to slide number 7, because this kind of points out the leap that agriculture has made, maybe from back in that era to more or less today. And if we put up slide number 7, we see a corn planter there. I believe he's planting corn. I can't see the boxes from here. And I think a couple rows, maybe 4 at the most, behind a little Alice Chalmers. Dan, where do you think that picture, what date could that be around?
Well, that looks to me like 1950. 1951, maybe?
Maybe.
Well, I would say it was before that.
Maybe even just
we had an
before.
Alice Chalmers tractor with rubber tires that looked very much like that in the late 1930s.
Harold's a rubber tire expert, so we have to let him have that one.
But I think on this whole question of machinery, we have to give credit to a lot of very innovative American agricultural engineers, we might call them. They didn't call themselves at that time. They were inventors, as we mentioned. The John Deere with the moldboard plow, Cyrus McCormick with the first reaper. These were all machines with horses that enabled farmers to produce much more than they ever could by hand. Then we had the transition from the horse-drawn equipment of the 1920s and 30s into adaptation of horse-drawn machinery to use it with tractors. And then following World War II, we saw major advances in our agricultural implements, agriculture machinery industries in inventing equipment that is much more productive and much more expensive.
Let's put slide number 8, because this absolutely visualizes what you're talking about there, Harold. And this shows a modern piece of farm equipment out there today. And quite frankly, the technology with each one of those rows has changed not a whole lot from the basic concept, but look at the modern advances.
That's right. You still have the corn planter boxes to feed the seed into each row, but you have I don't know, 15 or 20, 16, 20 rows, whereas in the 1930s, a 2-row corn planter was quite common, and then right after World War II, a 4-row corn planter was a big improvement, and look what we have today.
Yes, it's a major change. Well, that's the planting side of it. We're going to move ahead to slide number 9, because that's going to show us the harvesting side of it. Now, this slide number 9 is going to show us a fella that's out there, and he's just looked like he's having a lot of fun. What's he doing there, Harold?
Well, it looks like he's got a wagon box full of ear corn that he's husked by hand. Mm-hmm. And that was quite common in the 1920s to the 1930s. I remember the first mechanical corn pickers was a one-row picker, ear corn. And of course, we still were still harvesting ear corn up until post-World War II period.
We'll check out slide number 10 here. We're going to slide up here and move up to that era. Now, we've gone past the 1-row, and here we've got 2-row mechanical corn picker. That's a quantum leap right there.
Yes. And then the next advance was to build the 2-row or 4-row corn picker around the front of the tractor. And then, of course, when we went to field shelling,
there we go.
That was the big improvement.
Here we are today with mechanized and
World War II years.
There might even be a radio inside that tractor or that combine cab. I'm not sure.
There might even be a television.
Yeah, you never know. Well, Dan, what do you see from looking back and looking forward? In just a couple of seconds we've got left here, where's the history of agriculture going to go? Is there a boundary to it?
Well, the interesting thing, of course, is we always have to eat. And so I think as long as we have to eat, there will be farmers. And farmers are an important part of the industry of agriculture, but it's a bigger thing than just being on the farm. And I think there's a fine future, maybe for fewer and fewer people, but there's a future for agriculture.
Likewise, do you share that sentiment, Harold?
Exactly. But what we have to remember is that farmers, you're getting a lot of support on the production side as well as the marketing and processing side to produce the amount of food required to feed an expanding population.
I think what's interesting to note, and we all can see this, is that in agriculture today, it used to be, like you say, just the farmer, but now we have the marketing arm, the production side, the chemicals, the crop protection uses that we have. All of these things work together, and of course, the universities and the agricultural organizations play a big part in that too. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today. It's been fun. I hope this look back will give us a positive outlook for the future. And we want to thank you for joining us today. We hope this has been informative to you. And tune in again next time when once again we talk about Champaign County Agriculture Today. I'm Dennis Riggs. Thanks for listening.
Champaign County Agriculture Today is brought to you by Champaign County Farm Bureau.